Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in West Virginia. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is when you are listening to this narration. We want to know where and when these documented stories get to. Thomas Garrett, the town clerk of Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, was organizing the town's records in the winter of 1898 when he found something that would change the way he thought about his hometown forever. He found a lot of mentions of a family in the birth records from 1867 that were yellowed and had faded ink. According to every other historical record and living memory, this family never existed. Tax records, property deeds, church records, and even detailed medical reports all showed the Blackwood family, Father James, Mother Eleanor, and their household, but no one who lived in Harpers Ferry could remember ever meeting them. The municipal building where Garrett worked was a strong stone building built in 1851 that looked out over the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. The basement archives, which were always cold and smelled like mold and old paper, held the town's history in stacks of leather-bound books and metal filing cabinets. It was in that cold stone room, lit by gas lamps, that Garrett first touched the edges of a mystery that would take over the rest of his life. The first thing Garrett found was a property deed for a big house on Lancaster Hill that was written in May 1867. The house was described in great detail. It was 3 stories tall, had an octagonal tower, and was surrounded by 6 acres of woods. James Blackwood signed the deed, and it had a notary seal and the signatures of people who were known to be town officials at the time. The document even had a detailed sketch of the proposed building, drawn with such architectural accuracy that it looked like someone had been trained as an architect. Garrett was upset because he had lived in Harpers Ferry his whole life and knew every family name, every building, and every piece of land. There was a steep wooded slope north of town called Lancaster Hill, but there had never been a house there. The hillside was covered in thick trees, and there wasn't a clearing big enough for a big building. He had hunted and walked those hills as a boy and a man, but he had never seen anything like the grand home described in the deed. Garrett told Edward Harrison, the town's postmaster who had been there since before the Civil War, about what he had found the next day. Garrett talked about the Blackwood family and their home on Lancaster Hill, but Harrison's face stayed blank. "I've never heard of them," he said firmly. "I've delivered mail to every house in this town for 40 years. In the days that followed, Garrett's curiosity led him to find more records. These included 20 years' worth of tax payments from the Blackwoods, baptismal records for family members, letters between James Blackwood and the town council about road improvements, and even records of the family's regular grocery and coal deliveries. The papers weren't all in one place. They were spread out in the archives, next to records of real residents. Every paper looked real, with handwriting that was the same over the years, signs of wear and tear, and official stamps and signatures. Eleanor Blackwood's monthly purchases at Stalliker's General Store included flour, sugar, coffee, and fabric. The writing looked like Timothy Stalliker's, who had owned the store until he died in 1888. When Garrett asked Timothy's son, who was now in charge of the business, about the Blackwood account, the younger stallmaker looked through his books and saw that the family was not listed. Sometimes, after the municipal building's workers had gone home for the night, Garrett would hear footsteps on the wooden floors above when the building should have been empty. He looked around and only found empty rooms, with the windows tightly shut to keep out the winter drafts. He once clearly heard a drawer open and close in the record room next to his office, but when he checked, the room was locked and undisturbed, just like he had left it. Frank Miller, the night watchman, said he hadn't seen anyone come or go from the building during his shifts. He did say, though, "There have been nights when I could swear I heard conversations from the records room when no one was there. Men's and women's voices, talking low, like they didn't want to be overheard." Garrett started comparing the Blackwood records to other town records from the same time periods. The more he looked, the more the family seemed to fit into the history of Harpers Ferry. Eleanor Blackwood was at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting. After the Civil War, James was named as a donor to the rebuilding of St. Peter's Catholic Church. Strider's Pharmacy had a record of their purchases, which included medicines for everything from common colds to more serious conditions. According to the minutes of the town council meeting in September 1872, James Blackwood spoke out strongly against a proposed law that would limit hunting on the outskirts of town. The minutes wrote down everything he said, including the fact that some council members agreed with him. The ordinance was not passed, with 7 votes against it. However, when Garrett talked to William Chambers, who had been on the council during that time and was still alive, Chambers said he didn't remember any Blackwood speaking to the council or being involved in town business. "I remember that vote," Chambers said with a frown. It was a controversial issue. But Marcus Wilton, the tanner who lived by the lower bridge, spoke out against the ordinance. "There was no Blackwood involved. You must be misreading the minutes." But when Garrett looked at the minutes again, they clearly named James Blackwood as the speaker, with no mention of Marcus Wilton. There were other problems as well. An old photo of the town council from 1875, which is kept in the archives, showed 11 men standing formally on the steps of the town hall. The caption on the back says that James Blackwood was sitting second from the left, but the man in that spot was clearly Samuel Davis, the town banker. You could tell right away because of his unique mutton chop whiskers and big forehead. Garrett compared the picture to others from the same time and time again, proving Davis's identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. But there was something very wrong. The record showed that the Blackwoods had talked to, done business with, and gone to community events with real historical figures. However, none of these real people had left any personal records or journal entries that mentioned the Blackwoods. It was as if the family only existed in official records and not in people's minds. 3 weeks into Garrett's investigation, he made the most disturbing discovery. Dr. Samuel Wilkins was the town doctor from 1860 to 1888. In his medical records, he found detailed notes about how he treated the Blackwood family for different illnesses. The records were very detailed and included dates, symptoms, treatments, and results. Dr. Wilkins was said to have treated James Blackwood for a deep cut on his left forearm on the 10th of March, 1873. The cut needed 15 stitches. He went to Eleanor on the 2nd of July, 1876, because he thought he was suffering from nervous exhaustion after a family member died. There were a lot of other entries, mostly about everyday medical issues that happened during the Blackwood family's supposed time in Harper's Ferry. One entry from December 1878 stood out. Visited Blackwood residence upon urgent summons. Found no evidence of reported conditions. House appeared unoccupied, despite lights visible from road. Left without providing treatment. Will not return. This was the first time someone had suggested that something was wrong with the Blackwood family. Garrett looked for more notes from Dr. Wilkins about the Blackwoods, but he couldn't find any. It was as if the doctor had stopped acknowledging their existence after that night in December, even though other town records kept showing that they were still there. It was even more interesting to find entries in the doctor's personal expense ledger, which were found in a different file. In January 1879, he paid a researcher at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore a lot of money twice. The reason was not given, but the timing made it seem like it could have something to do with his time at the Blackwood house. In March, a third payment was made to someone only known as EP for consultation regarding documentary anomalies. This payment was bigger than the first 2 combined. The most unusual thing about the records was how suddenly they stopped. After the 15th of September, 1887, there were no more mentions of the Blackwoods. There were no death certificates, property sales, or travel records of people leaving. There was just a sudden absence where there had been careful records before. Garrett's last record was a payment for property tax, which was filed on time and correctly, just like all of their other payments. It didn't seem like it would be their last time dealing with the town's government. Garrett spent more time in the archives than at home as January turned into February. His wife said he was distracted, had dark circles under his eyes, and often stared at empty corners of rooms as if he could see something beyond the wallpaper and wood. The Blackwoods mystery was taking over his life, going from professional interest to personal obsession. He started having dreams about the family. They were very clear and detailed, like seeing elegant Eleanor Blackwood in her nice dresses, and stern James with his neat beard and watchful eyes. In these dreams, they never talked to him directly, but it always seemed like they were talking to each other just out of his hearing. They went into rooms he had never seen, in a house he knew was the one on Lancaster Hill that had never been built. He would wake up from these dreams feeling like he had lost something very important, like he had known these people very well but had somehow forgotten them. Sarah, his wife, became more and more worried. "Thomas, you've always been so methodical," she said one night at dinner when he was distracted and barely touched his food. "I've never seen you so obsessed with something. These people, this family, aren't worth your health." "But that's the point," he said, finally looking her in the eye. "These aren't people. They're not real. They're made-up, elaborate, detailed fabrications that only exist in town records. Don't you see how impossible that is? How disturbing? Who made them up and why? And how did they manage to put this fake family into decades of official records?" Sarah reached over the table and touched his hand. "Maybe there's a simple answer. Records get lost, names get mixed up, and mistakes happen all the time in paperwork. Not like this," he said firmly. "Not with this level of detail and consistency. And not just in one type of record, but in every official document the town made over the course of 20 years. This was on purpose, Sarah. Someone wanted this family to be remembered by the town, even if they never really lived there." Garrett was looking at a map of Harper's Ferry from 1871 night when he noticed something strange. Outside the municipal building, a snowstorm was howling. There was a clear outline of a big building with an octagonal tower on Lancaster Hill. The county surveyor made the map, and the town council approved it. Garrett had looked at town maps dozens of times in his career, but he had never seen this building on one before. He took out other maps from the archives, such as an 1865 survey that showed the hill before it was developed, and 1872 property map that showed the Blackwood House prominently, and an 1880 county map that showed the unique building again. Then, there was an 1890 map that showed Lancaster Hill, empty and forested again. This was after the Blackwoods had been removed from town records. The consequences were clear and scary. Whatever power put the Blackwood family in written records also changed official maps to show that they were real. After that, when the family disappeared from records, new maps were made without the house, or old maps were changed to take it out. Garrett hiked up Lancaster Hill the next morning. Even though there was a lot of snow, the slope was steep and the forest was full of oak and pine trees. There was no path to the house, and the snow that hadn't been disturbed showed no signs of other visitors. He got to the area shown on the map after almost an hour of hard climbing. He found a clearing that was about the same size as a big house and its yard. The trees around it were at least 30 years old, but the clearing itself was noticeably lacking in large plants. The ground was only covered with scrub brush and grass that had died in the winter. There was what looked like a foundation in the middle, but it was hard to see because of the snow. The stone blocks are set up in a way that could support a structure with an octagonal projection. Garrett felt a deep sense of wrongness as he stood in that quiet clearing, with only the distant murmur of the town below and the occasional falling of snow from heavy branches. It felt like the air was thicker here, making it harder for him to be there. The light also seemed different. It was dimmer, even though the winter sun was shining brightly above. He walked around the outside of the foundation and took note of its size. It was exactly what the property deed said it would be. He found a dip in the ground near what would have been the back of the house that looked like it could be a cellar or a place to store roots. He was getting more and more uneasy, but his curiosity won out. He cleared away the snow to find a set of stone steps leading down into the dark. Garrett thought for a moment. His logical mind told him that it was dangerous to go alone to an abandoned foundation in the winter, but the same drive that had made him spend weeks going over records that didn't make sense pushed him on. He went down the steps with a small lantern he had brought with him. The cellar was surprisingly intact. It was a room about 15 feet square with stone walls and a packed earth floor. Over the years, water had gotten in and left mineral deposits on the walls, but the room was otherwise empty.
There were no signs of the people who used to live here, like furniture or tools that had been left behind. As Garrett was about to leave, his lantern lit up something on the wall far away. Marks carved into the stone. He saw that they were names, dates, and short phrases carved into the stone with a lot of work. One said, "James Blackwood, not real." Another said, "Ella Laner Blackwood built." There were dozens of these inscriptions. Some of the names were ones he had seen before, while others were new to him. "We were never here. We never existed," was carved in bigger letters at the bottom of the wall than the rest. It looked like different people had carved the carvings over time. Some were old and faded, while others looked like they had just been made. The newest one, with its sharp edges and lack of mineral deposits, simply said SW 1878. Samuel Wilkins, the doctor who had refused to go back to the Blackwood house. As Garrett looked more closely at the wall, he saw something else. Small things stuck in the cracks between the stones, like a button, a tarnished coin, and a piece of what looked like a woman's brooch. Things that were left on purpose, like gifts or proof. He fought the urge to take any of them, believing that taking anything from this place would be bad luck. It seemed like the trip back down Lancaster Hill took a lot longer than the trip up. Garrett got lost twice and ended up walking in circles, even though he was sure he was going straight down. The shadows in the forest seemed to go in strange directions, and he thought he saw something tall and purposeful moving between the trees more than once. It wasn't animals or branches moving in the wind. It was dark by the time he got to town. Instead of going home, he went back to the city hall because he needed to figure out what he had found. The building was quiet and empty, with only a little bit of night lighting left for security in the hallways. Garrett took out every record from the archives that he had found that mentioned the Blackwoods. They were spread out on his desk and told the story of a family that had lived in the town for 20 years and then disappeared without a word. He looked over each document again, hoping to find something that would help him figure out what the cellar inscriptions meant. He found a small note in a church attendance register from 1877 that was written in a different hand than the main entries. It said, "The Blackwoods present, in record only." The note was signed S.W. Samuel Wilkins, the town doctor who had refused to go back to the Blackwood house. There were similar notes on a few other documents that were easy to miss. For example, on a property tax assessment from 1879, it said, "No structure visible at this location despite records." On the back of a town council attendance sheet with James Blackwood's name on it, it said, "No such person addressed the council, witnessed personally." Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold winter night. He started looking for papers that Dr. Wilkins had signed or worked on. While writing a report to the town council about a scarlet fever outbreak in 1880, he came across another note that said, "Cannot continue this deception. The empty house remains on the hill. The names appear in my patient logs, though I have never treated these people." It looked like Dr. Wilkins had noticed the same strange consistency that had bothered Garrett. Records of people who lived in the town, but didn't leave any memories or personal accounts. People wrote down everything carefully, but no one remembered it. The most clear statement in a ledger entry from 1881 was, "Have consulted with E. Phillips of Baltimore regarding documentary phenomena. His expertise in archival anomalies suggests deliberate manipulation rather than clerical error. Recommend full investigation, but fear consequences of drawing attention to these inconsistencies. There is no record of such an investigation ever happening." The Blackwoods were still talked about for 6 more years, but Dr. Wilkins or anyone else didn't add any more notes to the margins to question their existence. It was like Wilkins had sounded an alarm that no one paid attention to, or that someone had turned off. As midnight drew near, Garrett found himself looking at the property deed that had started his investigation. James Blackwood's signature was beautiful and written with confidence. Garrett quickly compared it to other signatures in the archives, such as those of the town mayor, the county judge, and other well-known people. He didn't find an exact match, but the way the flourishes and letters were formed were similar enough to suggest that the person who signed James Blackwood's name had also signed a lot of other documents in the town records. There are documents that go back decades, some of which are from before the Blackwood family is said to have moved to Harper's Ferry. Garrett spent more than an hour comparing handwriting samples and became more and more sure that the same person who had written official town records for years had also written many of the Blackwood documents. The meaning was shocking. Someone in the town's government had made up an entire family and put them in the historical record. But why? What could such a complicated lie be for? And how did this person manage to make not only written records, but also influence maps, architectural plans, and photos? The scope suggested that it wasn't just one person acting alone, but something more planned and organized. The municipal building creaked and settled around him as the winter winds pushed against its stone walls. Garrett heard footsteps from somewhere above, a sound he was used to by now. Instead of going to look into it this time, he stayed at his desk and listened as they moved from room to room, getting closer and closer to the archives. Outside the archive door, the footsteps stopped. Garrett held his breath and stared at the doorknob. The door opened slowly, revealing a dimly lit, empty hallway. There was no one there, but Garrett could feel someone watching him, waiting and knowing what he had found. At that moment of irrational certainty, he took the Blackwood papers and left the building. He walked quickly through the snowy streets to his house. When he got there, he locked the doors and sat down at the kitchen table to keep looking over the papers. As he looked over the records, he saw a pattern that he hadn't seen before. The Blackwoods were most often mentioned in records after times of community trauma, such as after the Civil War destroyed the area, after a flood in 1870 that damaged much of the lower town, and after a diphtheria outbreak in 1876 that killed 17 children. It was like the family had been added to the historical record at times when the town's attention was elsewhere, when confusion and loss might have made new residents less noticeable. What was even more disturbing was how the Blackwoods seemed to take in or replace real historical events. Garrett compared newspaper articles with town records and found that actions that news reports said were done by real residents were credited to James or Ella Laner Blackwood in official records. The made-up family seemed to be slowly taking over the town's real history, replacing real people with made-up ones. Garrett was still at his kitchen table in the morning, with papers all around him. His wife was worried about how messy he looked and the crazy ideas he had. He tried to explain what he had found, that someone had systematically made up a fake family and put them in town records over the course of decades. That the empty house on Lancaster Hill had never really been lived in, but was shown on official maps and deeds, and that Dr. Wilkins had noticed the difference and tried to warn others through his coded notes. His wife's face went from worried to scared. "Thomas," she said carefully, "Harper's Ferry does not have a Lancaster Hill." Garrett looked at her, not understanding. Lancaster Hill was a big part of the town's geography that they could see from their own home. He led her to the window and pointed to the wooded hill that rose to the north. "That's Jefferson's Ridge," she said. "It's always been Jefferson's Ridge." Garrett thought for a moment that this might be a joke or a test, but Sarah's face showed that she was really confused when he said that the hill had another name. "Maybe you're thinking of Lancaster County," she said softly. "That's in Pennsylvania, which isn't far from here." The next day, Garrett doubted his memory and his sanity. He went back to the city hall but stayed away from the archives. Instead, he looked at public maps in the reference room. Each one clearly labeled the slope north of town as Jefferson's Ridge. There was no sign of Lancaster Hill on any map. He casually asked a few people who had lived there for a long time what the name of the northern hill was. Everyone quickly said that it was Jefferson's Ridge. People had never heard of Lancaster Hill. That night, he went to see Martin Fletcher, the oldest man in town. He was 93 years old and had lived in Harper's Ferry since before the Civil War. Fletcher looked confused at first, then thoughtful when Garrett asked about Lancaster Hill. The old man said slowly, "There was talk of naming the North Ridge that back in 66 or 67 after Abraham Lancaster, who owned timberland there. But he died before it was decided, and the name never took." "Why do you want to know?" Garrett couldn't bring himself to say. He instead asked Fletcher if he remembered the Blackwood family, who lived in a big house with an octagonal tower. Fletcher's eyes got cloudy. He said with certainty, "There are no Blackwoods in Harper's Ferry." Then, more hesitantly, "I remember hearing about a house that was supposed to be built on the ridge. An architect from Baltimore drew up big plans for it. Lancaster ordered it before he died. Of course, it was never built." Garrett asked, "How did Lancaster die?" He felt a chill, even though Fletcher's fireplace was warm. "Odd business," Fletcher said under his breath. "Found in the woods up on the ridge, at the site where his house was to be built. They said it was heart failure, but there were rumors. Some said the land wasn't meant to be built on. Old native burial ground, perhaps, though I never put much stock in such tales." Garrett stopped by the town's small newspaper office on his way home. Since 1845, the Harper's Ferry Gazette had been coming out every week. Maybe Lancaster's death was reported if it was important. The newspaper's archives were in good shape, but they weren't organized as well as the city records. Garrett found what he was looking for after an hour of searching: a short obituary from March 1866. Abraham Lancaster, 57, a well-known businessman and landowner, was found dead on his property north of town. He had no immediate family. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. A week later, a longer article talked about the settlement of Lancaster's estate. His properties were to be sold, and the money given to the town for public improvements because he had no heirs. The newspaper called it Lancaster's Ridge, and the large areas of land there were to be divided up and sold to builders. Garrett looked through later issues to see if there were any mentions of these sales, but there weren't any. It was as if the plans had been forgotten after Lancaster died. The ridge went back to being wild, and in people's minds, its name changed from Lancaster's Ridge to Jefferson's Ridge. That night, Garrett went back to Lancaster Hill, which everyone else seemed to call Jefferson's Ridge. It was hard to find the path he had taken the day before in the dark, but he finally made it to the clearing with the foundation stones. But the clearing wasn't there. There was only unbroken forest where he remembered an open space with the outline of a big house. Tall trees grew where the foundation used to be, and their trunks were thick with age. Garrett was lost and wandered the hillside until dawn, looking for the cellar door, the carved names, or any other signs of what he had seen. He only found trees, rock outcroppings, and his own footprints in the snow. When he finally got to town, tired and confused, he went straight to the city hall. The property deeds, tax records, and medical reports in the archives would show that the Blackwoods had existed in writing, if not in reality. But when he looked through the filing cabinets and shelves where he had found these records over the past few weeks, he only found regular town papers. There was no property deed for a house on Lancaster Hill, no tax payments from James Blackwood, and no strange notes from Dr. Wilkins. There was no longer a map showing the octagonal house. Instead, there was a similar map from the same year that clearly showed Jefferson's Ridge, but not the building. "Are you looking for something in particular, Thomas?" asked his assistant, Marion Ridley. "You look upset." Garrett said, "The Blackwood files," trying to keep his voice steady. "The papers about the family that lived on Lancaster, on the North Ridge. I put them all together." Marion's face was blank. "I don't know of any Blackwood family in our records, and I've never heard the ridge called Lancaster anything. It's Jefferson's Ridge." Garrett's co-workers became worried as he searched the archives in a panic, claiming that records were missing. The doctor in town was called, and Garrett was given medicine to calm him down and taken home to sleep. The doctor said, "Exhaustion, maybe a nervous condition caused by working too much." Garrett stayed at home for 3 days while his wife took care of him. On the 4th day, he had a visitor, Harold Wilkins, who was the old son of Dr. Samuel Wilkins. "My dad left a letter that was to be opened 30 years after he died," Harold said as he sat in Garrett's living room. "That time came last month. The letter said your name, Mr. Garrett, and said that if you ever started asking questions about people who only exist in records, I was to give you this." He handed Garrett a yellowed envelope. There was only 1 page inside, and it was written in the careful handwriting of a man who died 30 years ago. It started with Thomas Garrett. "You've probably found the Blackwoods by now. But there may be others. If you're reading this, you found what I found. Proof that people who never existed lived in our town. The letter went on to say that Dr. Wilkins first noticed problems in 1875 when a patient told him that he had treated them when he hadn't. He looked into it and found records of the visit in his own logbook, written in his own hand, even though he didn't remember it. Wilkins wrote down dozens of other inconsistencies that were mostly about the Blackwood family over the next 3 years. He went to their supposed address and found a partially built foundation that had been left unfinished after Abraham Lancaster's death, not the big house that town records said it was. Wilkins wrote, "I became convinced that someone was systematically altering town records to insert this fictional family into our history, but upon closer examination, I found something far more disturbing. The alterations were not limited to adding new documents. Existing records were changing." He talked about how he had compared notes he had taken at town council meetings with the official minutes and found differences. Names were changed, and events were rewritten. He checked his own notes again later and saw that they had also changed to match the new official record. It was like reality was being changed, both on paper and in memory. What bothered him the most was that the records themselves seemed to change. He would later find documents that he had marked or written on that looked like they hadn't been touched. New records would show up in archives, as if they had always been there. After talking to someone in Baltimore who knows a lot about preserving documents and spotting forgeries, the strange E. Phillips wrote in his expense ledger that Wilkins had done an experiment. He made detailed personal notes about what he saw, and kept one copy in his office and another in a sealed box that he buried on his property. When he looked at the 2 copies of the documents months later, the office copy had changed a lot, with references to the Blackwoods changed or taken out completely. The buried copy stayed the same as he had written it. Wilkins wrote, "I believe that something is using our town's records to make up a false history, making people and events through official papers, and changing our memories to keep us from seeing the differences. I don't know what it is, or why it is doing this. I only know that the phenomena got worse after I started actively looking into them. New fake people showed up in records, and my own notes were changed." The most scary part of Wilkins's letter was when he talked about a night in December 1878 when he was called to the Blackwood house, which was still sometimes called Lancaster Hill. "I found the foundation as I expected. No house stood there. Yet from a distance, I could see lights, as if from windows, moving figures, as if people walked inside a structure that did not exist. When I approached, these apparitions vanished, leaving only the stone outline in the snow." Wilkins said that on the way home that night, he was followed by something he could only describe as a presence without form, observing me with what I can only describe as hunger. In the weeks that followed, he found that his medical records were getting more and more visits from patients he had never seen and treatments he had never given, all connected to the Blackwood family. The letter ended with, "If you pursue this matter, be aware that you may find yourself similarly affected. Already, I suspect my memory has been altered in ways I cannot detect. The only safety I found was in ceasing my investigation entirely. I recommend you do the same." Harold Wilkins saw Garrett read the letter twice, then again. He said softly, "People thought my father was pretty sane. But after 1887, he stopped keeping written records of his patients. He remembered everything until the day he died." "Did he ever tell you why?" Garrett asked. "He only said that paper could change when you weren't looking at it," Harold said. "We thought it was just an old man's quirk. Now I wonder if he knew something we didn't." Garrett sat quietly for a long time after Harold left. Jefferson's Ridge rose against the winter sky outside his window, a ridge he had always known by another name, with a house that had never been built and people who had never lived there except in carefully kept records. It was too scary to think about what it meant. If Dr. Wilkins was right, something was changing not only the town's records, but also people's memories, in a way that made a false history that included made-up parts so well that no one noticed the differences. And whatever this force was, it had been working in Harper's Ferry for at least 30 years, and maybe even longer. He set fire to Dr. Wilkins's letter in his fireplace that night. The next day, he went back to work at the city hall, apologized for his strange behavior, and went back to doing his normal tasks. He never went into the archives by himself again and turned down any work that involved historical records. But sometimes, on his way home at night, he would look up at Jefferson's Ridge and see lights shining from windows in a house that wasn't there. It was a tall building with an octagonal tower just like the ones that used to exist. Months went by. Garrett didn't tell anyone about the Blackwoods, Dr. Wilkins's letter, or what happened to him on the ridge. Over time, the town forgot about the strange things he did that winter. Sarah even stopped worrying about him and accepted that whatever temporary insanity had taken hold of her husband was over. But Garrett still remembered. He kept a journal in a locked drawer in his desk at home. In it, he wrote down everything he could remember about the Blackwoods and his investigation. Every night, he would read what he had written the night before and then add new thoughts or memories. He often noticed inconsistencies, little things that seemed to change with each reading, as if his own memories were being changed in small ways. To fight back, he started leaving small things that reminded him of his memories. A stone from the foundation, a button he found in the cellar, and a page from a town record that mentioned the Blackwoods. However, when he looked again later, the name had changed to someone else's. These physical anchors helped him keep some of his memories straight, even though he was starting to doubt how reliable his own mind was. Garrett saw the same things happen with other town records in the years that followed. There would be new names in old documents, people who lived there but no one remembered them but who were well documented in official papers. Sometimes, records would replace real residents with fake ones, and the actions and contributions of these fake residents would be credited to them. The phenomenon appeared to intensify during periods of communal stress or transformation, such as following fires, floods, or economic recessions. It was as if these times of trouble gave people a chance to change the past, change their memories, and change reality. Garrett never looked into these strange things again. Dr. Wilkins's warning was clear, and Garrett's own experiences proved how dangerous it was. But he kept an eye on them and wrote down what he saw in his private journal. He wondered what these documentary ghosts were for. Thomas Garrett died of pneumonia at the age of 62 in 1905. After he died, his wife looked through his personal papers and found no mention of the Blackwood family, Lancaster Hill, or any searches of town records. It was like those weeks of obsessive research never happened. The locked drawer where he kept his journal was empty, except for regular bills and letters. Sarah Garrett felt a strange emptiness as she went through her husband's things. It was as if something important was missing from the record of his life, but she couldn't figure out what it was, and eventually the feeling went away, leaving her with the normal grief of being a widow. 3 years later, while workers were fixing up the municipal building, they found a sealed metal box hidden in a wall near the archives. Inside was a journal in Garrett's unique handwriting that talked about his investigation and why he decided to stop it. The town clerk put the journal away and forgot about it until 1957, when historian Margaret Holloway found it while looking for information for a book about Harper's Ferry's architectural history. Holloway was very interested in a house that Garrett wrote about in his journal. It was a big building with an octagonal tower that was said to be on Lancaster Hill. She was interested in the detailed descriptions of a building that, according to all other records, had never existed because she was an expert on 19th century architecture. Her further investigation uncovered something troubling. From 1905 to 1908, town records said many times that Thomas Garrett was still the town clerk 3 years after he died. The records had meeting minutes with his signature, tax assessments he had supposedly made, and letters he had supposedly written. All of these papers were filed correctly, aged correctly, and written in what handwriting experts agreed was Garrett's unique style. Sarah Garrett's diaries from the same time clearly talked about her being a widow, and church records confirmed Thomas Garrett's funeral and burial in 1905. Holloway also found pictures of town council meetings from 1906 and 1907 that seemed to show Garrett sitting with the other officials. However, his face was always a little blurry or shadowed, as if the camera had moved at the time of exposure. None of the elderly residents she spoke to who had been to these meetings remembered Garrett being there, but they all agreed that he had been a well-liked town clerk years earlier. Holloway's research took her to the land that used to be called Lancaster Hill. but is now known to everyone as Jefferson's Ridge. County records showed that the area had been a forest with no buildings since the town was founded. But when she hiked to the place Garrett had written about in his journal, she found small signs of human activity. Depressions in the ground that could have been the foundation of a building, now covered in decades of forest growth. Her most interesting find was a single picture in a folder of random photos at the Town Historical Society. It showed a big house with an octagonal tower on a cleared hillside that looked a lot like Jefferson's Ridge. The picture was taken in 1877 and had the words Blackwood Residence written in faded ink on it. The person in charge of the collection didn't know when or how the picture had been gotten. The next day, when Holloway went back to the Historical Society to look at the picture again, it was gone from the folder. The curator said they had never seen the picture before and that it had never been part of their collection. Holloway said that she might have mixed it up with a picture of the Harper House, a well-known local building that looked nothing like the one she had seen. Holloway's investigation grew over the next 11 years, moving from Harper's Ferry to other towns in the area. She saw the same kinds of strange things in documents, people who were only mentioned in official records, buildings that were thoroughly documented but never built, and events that were recorded in multiple sources but not remembered by anyone who was there. In each case, these strange events happened around times of community trauma or change. After a terrible flood in 1852, a made-up family showed up in the records of Cumberland, Maryland. After a fire destroyed much of the town center in 1845, there were reports of ghostly buildings in Shepherdstown. During the chaotic time of early Reconstruction in Winchester, Virginia, entire town council meetings that never happened were carefully recorded. Holloway posited a theory that these documentary anomalies signify a psychological reaction to communal trauma, a manifestation of collective false memory embedded in official records. Her academic colleagues rejected this explanation as lacking rigor, noting that false memories are usually inconsistent among individuals and not systematically recorded in official records with uniform details. Others suggested more straightforward reasons, like mistakes made by clerks, intentional fraud, or misidentifying records. However, none of these explanations elucidated the consistent patterns Holloway had discerned across various communities and temporal contexts. Nor did they address the propensity of the records to alter in the absence of direct observation. Holloway's research notes were supposed to be published in the West Virginia Historical Quarterly in 1968. The manuscript was sent to the press after being accepted. But her article wasn't in the journal when it came out. The editor said they had no record of getting her submission, even though Holloway had a signed letter saying they would accept it. When she called the editor-in-chief of the journal, he was confused and looked through their records, but he couldn't find any record of her article being submitted or accepted. He denied ever having seen or signed the acceptance letter she gave him, even though it had his signature on it. Also, the letter was written at a time when he was in the hospital after a car accident and couldn't have been in the office to look over manuscripts. During an office move at Shepherd College later that same year, the original manuscript, Garrett's journal, and all of Holloway's research materials went missing. Holloway herself said that her work had been intentionally hidden, but she never said who did it or why. Her academic reputation suffered as she became more insistent with her claims. Her co-workers started to stay away from her, saying that her obsession with documentary errors had made her judgment worse. The more she complained about her research going missing, the more people called her paranoid or confused. She died in 1969, and all she left behind was a single page of notes in her diary. Somehow, the town's records are still around. They make people, they keep people alive after they die. They build houses that have never been built, and they protect themselves by changing not only documents, but also their memories. I won't look any further. There are some histories that should stay hidden. For years, Holloway's work was ignored and thought to be the ramblings of a historian who had once shown promise, but whose mental health had gotten worse. But in 1982, while Harper's Ferry's historical records were being digitized, a computer technician named David Chen saw something strange. The database he was making to keep track of the town's records kept having problems. The next day, records he had entered would look a little different. Names changing, dates moving, whole entries disappearing, or new ones showing up. He thought at first that these strange things were caused by software bugs or mistakes he made when entering data. He started keeping detailed records of the changes, backing up his database several times a day and comparing versions as the problems continued. The patterns that came out were scary. The changes weren't random. They seemed to have a purpose, making coherent alternative histories that were slightly different from the documented past. Most of these changes added people and events that couldn't be confirmed by outside sources. Records from the 1,920 seconds, such as tax rolls, church registries, and business licenses, show that a family named Corwin lived in the area, but no local historians had ever heard of them. Building permits and council minutes from 1935 went into great detail about a town hall annex, including architectural plans and construction costs. However, no such building had ever been built. Chen found electronic records that made a documented life for Thomas Garrett that went on long after his death in 1905. This was the most troubling thing of all. Digital scans of original documents showed that he was still involved in town business until 1915, even though cemetery records showed that he had died 10 years earlier. Chen tried to fix these mistakes, but the changes didn't last. Data he had deleted would come back. Changes he made would go back to the changed versions. It was as if the database had a mind of its own and wouldn't let go of these made-up parts of the town's history. Chen's boss was worried about how long it was taking to finish the digitization project, so he blamed the problems on technical issues and moved Chen to a different department. His replacement, who didn't take as much care to check the data, just added the strange records to the final database without seeming to notice that they were impossible in the past. But Chen couldn't forget what he had learned. He spent his free time looking for similar strange things in other town archives and eventually found references to Margaret Holloway's unpublished work. Even though her original research was lost, he found references to it in letters she had sent to other historians and in the minutes of academic conferences she had gone to. Chen finally found Holloway's niece, who is now an old woman living in Baltimore, by following these clues. She remembered how her aunt was obsessed with what she called documentary phantoms. She also remembered that Holloway had kept extra notes hidden in her house, separate from the materials that had gone missing. Holloway's niece got these notes after she died. They were kept in a metal box in her old home. For years, they had been left unopened because people thought they were the work of a crazy person. Chen got the niece to let him look at them. What he found was an investigation that had been carefully documented for almost 20 years. Holloway had found similar problems with official records in many communities in the Mid-Atlantic region. He found that these fake people and buildings were always added in the same way. What she found most interesting was that these strange things weren't random. They seemed to have a purpose, to fill in the gaps in people's memories after traumatic events, to create continuity where there had been disruption, and to create false histories that were somehow easier to understand or more palatable than the messy truth of what really happened. Holloway had written, "It's as if the records themselves are trying to heal the communities they document, making fake people to take the place of those who died in war or disease, making fake buildings where real ones were destroyed, adding years to people's lives on paper when they are really dead." But why and how do just documents have this power to change not only the written record, but also memory itself? Chen's look at Holloway's notes took him back to where her investigation had started, Thomas Garrett's journal, which talked about the Blackwood family and the house on Lancaster Hill that was somehow both there and not there. Holloway's research shows that the original journal and her manuscript both went missing in 1968. But in her note, she said she had made a photographic copy that she had kept separate from her research materials. Chen got the details of Garrett's original investigation from this copy, which was kept with Holloway's personal things. He was struck by how similar it was to his own experience, the changing records, the refusal to make changes, and the feeling that someone was actively changing documents to add and keep fake parts in the historical record. In 1983, Chen wrote an article for the Journal of Archival Science about what he called documentary echo phenomena. These are the patterns that official records tend to show that can't be verified by outside sources. He carefully stayed away from Holloway's more speculative ideas about why these anomalies happened on purpose, instead presenting them as an interesting way that clerical errors spread. The article didn't get much attention outside of expert circles. But in less than a year, Chen heard from archivists and historians in 17 different states who had similar things happen in their own collections. Records that changed when they weren't being looked at. Ghostly people in places that were well documented, but not remembered by anyone, and historical narratives that changed to fit these fictions, becoming more internally coherent but diverging from external reality. Chen set up a small conference in 1985 for researchers who had seen these strange things. They met in a hotel in Baltimore to talk about what they had seen and try to come up with a theoretical framework for understanding it. The agreement that came out was scary. The things that were wrong with these documentaries weren't limited to one place or time. It looked like it was happening everywhere, maybe even everywhere, because of the nature of documentation itself rather than just in one place. It also seemed to be getting worse as records were digitized, as if the switch from paper to electronic storage had made the effect stronger. The most disturbing part was realizing that these strange things were not only affecting the records themselves, but were also somehow changing people's memories to match the changed records. People who saw things happen would eventually start to remember them as they were recorded, not as they really happened. The longer an unusual record was around, the more it seemed to take the place of real memories and experiences. The people who went to the conference agreed to set up a network for sharing what they had seen and coming up with new ways to do research. In honor of the first two people to write about the phenomenon, they named it the Garrett Holloway Archive, but the network started to break up after a few months. Participants said it was hard to get to their own research notes. Electronic messages would come through changed or not at all. People would forget about phone calls as soon as they were over. By the end of 1986, the network was pretty much gone. Chen tried to set up a second conference, but most of the people who had been at the first one didn't remember it. Some said they had never talked to him about problems with the documentary. Some people had come up with other explanations for the things they had seen, saying they were caused by normal things instead of the more disturbing patterns they had seen before. Chen started to question his own memories and thoughts. The notes from the conference didn't seem as interesting as he remembered them. He might have been able to explain the patterns he saw in the Harper's Ferry archives as normal human mistakes instead of something strange about the documents themselves. He published a retraction of his earlier article in 1987, saying that his conclusions were wrong because of mistakes in his methods and confirmation bias. He quit his job at the Harper's Ferry Historical Archives and got a job managing commercial databases. He never did any more historical research after that. People who visit Harper's Ferry still sometimes say they see lights on Jefferson's Ridge where there is no building. There are still references to people who lived in the town in the 19th century that no historical record can confirm ever existed. In the municipal archives, which have been modernized and computerized, new entries sometimes show up in old databases. People who don't have birth certificates, school records, or any other proof of their existence other than official documents. People who, according to every record, live in houses that were never built, on a hill whose name changes depending on who you ask and when. The most troubling thing is probably how these fake entries keep spreading. Researchers who look at them too closely often see their own notes change and their memories get fuzzy, making them unsure of what is real history and what is made up. The Blackwoods started something that has never stopped. It has only gotten more advanced and harder to find. The records of Harper's Ferry still contain people who never existed, but now they are joined by others, other families, other individuals, who exist only as data, as officially registered ghosts. This is because record keeping has changed from handwritten ledgers to computerized databases. Some archivists have said that these documentary ghosts have a purpose. They somehow keep the memory of the community together during times of trauma and change. That without them, the historical record would break up into contradictions that can't be fixed, making it impossible to keep the stories that connect communities across time. Some people have darker ideas, like that something is feeding on human memory and experience, taking real history and replacing it with lies that serve some alien purpose we can't understand. That the records have somehow developed a kind of consciousness and are changing reality to fit their own internal logic. The most troubling aspect is the potential that this phenomenon extends beyond Harper's Ferry and the communities examined by Margaret Holloway. That it could be true for all records, all written history. That what we think of as the real past might be full of these lies, these people, places, and events that never happened outside of the records that show them. Maybe there are records of you and me in those archives. Lives that are written down in great detail, even though we've never been to that town. Names of people who were at meetings we didn't go to. Medical records of treatments we never got. All of them are waiting for a future archivist to find them and realize how impossible it is and start asking questions. Questions that will take them to records that change when no one is looking, to memories that don't match the records, to houses that are on maps but not on the ground, and to the horrible truth of people who never lived but still haunt the records of a town. Since these investigations, many people have tried to write about or figure out what happened. Rachel Morales, a graduate student, spent a summer in Harper's Ferry in 1993, studying what she called documentary displacement. This is the tendency of official records to make coherent but false stories that take the place of real historical events. Her work was mostly about how Thomas Garrett's documented life went on after his death. She found hundreds of records showing that he was still involved in town affairs from 1905 to 1915. Some of these records were photos of him in groups, but they were always a little blurry or shadowy. Morales came up with a theory that documentary systems have a kind of inertia, which means they don't want to accept the deaths or departures of important people. Instead of capturing the disruptive reality of loss, the documents establish continuity by perpetuating these lives on paper, gradually reallocating their roles to others over time, rather than confronting the abrupt cessation of life. Her thesis advisor told her not to pursue this line of questioning because it was too speculative for serious academic study. When Morales kept going, she noticed that her research notes were different each time she went to the archives. Details she clearly remembered writing down would be changed or left out. Eventually, her thesis changed to focus on more traditional parts of archival science, and her work on documentary displacement was only a short footnote in the final text. After getting her degree, Morales got a job at the Library of Congress, where she sometimes saw similar things happen at the National Archives. She never wrote about the subject again, but she kept a private collection of notes and examples that she shared with a small group of other researchers who were interested in the same thing. This network noticed a big rise in documentary anomalies in 2012, which happened at the same time as the mass digitization of historical records. Researchers saw an increase in what they called record propagation as archives across the country converted paper documents to electronic formats. This is the tendency for fictional elements to spread from one documentary system to another, making an alternative history that is more and more consistent. The Blackwood family, who had only been mentioned in records from Harper's Ferry, started showing up in digitized records from nearby towns. James Blackwood was named as a delegate to business conventions in the area. Ella Lahner was a member of women's suffrage groups. Their presence in the historical record grew both geographically and temporally, reaching back to earlier times and forward to the early 20th century, well beyond the years 1867 to 1887 when they were first documented. The researchers were most worried about how these documentary phantoms started to take the place of real historical people. People who were actually there and took part in these events were slowly erased from the records, and their work and contributions were given to the Blackwoods and other made-up groups. It was as if the documentary system was making history easier to understand by combining a lot of different roles into a smaller number of consistent, well-documented, but completely made-up characters. By 2018, the phenomenon had advanced to encompass digital native records, data that had not previously existed in paper format. The Blackwoods and other documentary ghosts started to show up in databases, social media archives, and electronic communications that were made after the fact. They made profiles on websites that were already archived and added profile pictures that were made up of pictures of several real people. The researchers who were keeping an eye on this phenomenon found themselves more and more alone and unsure. Colleagues who were interested in their work at first would later say they never had those conversations. Journals that accepted articles on the subject would later not have any record of the submissions. Members would sometimes question whether previous meetings or discussions had actually happened, even within their own network. This was because their memories were becoming less and less consistent with their notes and records. In 2022, the network pretty much fell apart because its members couldn't agree on what they had seen or come to a conclusion. Some people said that documentary phantoms were real and were a basic part of how recorded information works. Some people thought the whole idea was just conspiracy thinking or a misunderstanding of normal mistakes made by clerks. Some people couldn't remember why they had been interested in the subject in the first place. The phenomenon is still going on today, mostly without being seen or talked about. Archivists sometimes see inconsistencies in their collections, but they think they are caused by mistakes made by people or problems with technology, not by some strange quality of the documents themselves. Historians find inconsistencies in different sources, but they always use standard scholarly methods to figure them out. They never think that the records might be making up different stories on their own. But for those who know what to look for, the signs are everywhere. The subtle changes in real people and events that are replaced by more consistently documented fictional ones. The way records change when they aren't directly observed, and the way memory seems to align over time with documented fiction rather than lived experience. The people who never existed but still haunt the records of a town, and maybe all records everywhere, are still slowly making their way into human history. We don't know what they want or where they came from. Are they an inherent characteristic of information, a psychological reaction to trauma and disruption, an entirely different entity, or a conscious and deliberate phenomenon? We may never know. Maybe we aren't supposed to know. It is possible that simply looking into these documentary ghosts makes us more open to their influence, and that our memories and records can be changed, and our findings will be forgotten or ignored. But the next time you look through old records, pay attention to the names that come up too often, the events that seem too well documented, and the stories that are too coherent to be real history, which is always messy and contradictory. You might be looking at them, the people who never existed but whose records get bigger and more detailed every year. They have patience. They keep going. And they are waiting for people like Thomas Garrett, Margaret Holloway, and David Chen to find them. These people see the impossible things that are right in front of us in our documented past. It is not yet clear if such a discovery will bring light or dirt